Hello, friends. This is Doug Schaible, and welcome to the Premature Bible Institute. Once again, I'm up here still in Waukesha, Wisconsin, but going to be leaving tomorrow for another place, and I'll get maybe work on something while I'm over there. But just want to thank you for listening to these lessons. Like I say, I like to refer to myself as your free-range podcaster, and very glad to be able to do this. And I've just been very encouraged by some of the responses I've been getting from it. There have been people that have told me that this was the first time they'd heard some of the stuff this way, and there were things that were brought out that they had never thought about. And so I'm very glad for that and very grateful. We're going to start off with this lesson. This is the second part of what we're talking about, how God was bringing Israel to Mount Sinai to prepare them for the giving of the law. He hasn't given them the law quite yet, but he's getting them prepared for it. And so that's what we're going to deal with today. And in order to do that, let's go back here to the last lesson. We're talking about how God brought the Israelites out of Egypt. They've come through the wilderness. They've had some complaints and some issues along the way, but now they're coming to Mount Sinai. And while he's there, he reminds them of who he is, that he is the eternal God, the Lord, the Lord from heaven, the one who created the universe, but he is the one that did all of this for them. So he reminds them of who he is, but once again, he did not deliver them in ways that man could deliver himself. So he was using miraculous things in order to prove that he was God, or to show them, I shouldn't say prove, but more the idea of displaying to them his power and his greatness and goodness. But he didn't deliver them through natural means like, just the sea drying up and then they walk over. What he did is he caused the sea to open up, and then they walked over in the middle of it with the waves on both sides. So that was really unusual. And he had Moses strike the rock and water came out. He brought the quail in, so many that they couldn't number, right after they had asked for it. And the manna that was on the ground every morning for 40 years it was doing that. But anyway, he didn't deliver them in just ways that man could say, we did it. He wanted them to know that he did it. So as they come to Mount Sinai, he gets ready to present the people of Israel with a contract. In order to be his people, he was going to say this. He says, if you do what I tell you, I will bless you. But if you don't, I'll curse you. So that was the contract, and he was asking them if they wanted to agree with that term. And so this contract, or testament as we call it, and when we refer to the Old Testament, what we're referring to is this particular contract that God had with Israel. So Israel agreed to the terms of the contract. Just like if you're buying a house, you have certain terms that you have to agree with, to pay by a certain time, to pay so much a month, or you forfeit the house. Well, in the same way here, God is presenting the contract, and the people of Israel are agreeing to this contract, which bound them to honor it. But it also bound God to honor his side of the contract too. So, and the contract was simple. It demanded perfect obedience, not partial, but absolutely perfect obedience. They had to agree with God and do everything that he had required in his law. And the people said, yeah, all that he says, we will do. So that's how that came about. So, and as a result of that, now we have them there, the people standing before Mount Sinai, and God decides he's going to speak to them. So in Exodus chapter 19, verses 16 through 20, it says this. Then it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunderings and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain. And the sound of the trumpet was very loud, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. In other words, they were scared to death over this thing. They trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God. And they stood at the foot of the mountain. So they're all gathered. They're sitting there at the foot of the mountain. Moses brings them to that, to talk with God. Now Mount Sinai was completely in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. And when the blast of the trumpet sounded long and became louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him by voice. Then the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. So now they're there. Moses speaks to God. God speaks back to him, says, go up, come up to the mountain. Moses goes up onto the mountain. And so all the people watch him go up there in the smoke and fire and everything, and they watch him going up there, don't know what's going on. So can you imagine the fear the people had? A lot of us have seen movies like War of the Worlds, the newer version that had Tom Cruise in it, the Steven Spielberg version of it, or we've seen Independence Day. And they tend to, you see these things where they have these blasts of a trumpet and where they come in fire and smoke and stuff. And people say, that must be what it was like. I said, no. I says, that's because people who say that kind of get it wrong. They think that what the Bible did was borrow what those guys did, when it was the other way around. Those guys, Spielberg and the people who did Independence Day, they looked at biblical imagery and they borrowed from it to make their movies. But even when they did that, we look at that and it's just kind of a scary sound, that big blast of that trumpet, just a real loud sound of smoke and fire and everything. It just looks awful. Well, can you imagine what it would be like if that was real life and you saw that happening? And I would imagine God's trumpet was louder and stronger, and it was smokier and more fire than you can possibly imagine. So God did that, and so the people were very, very afraid. And so these artists, these movie makers, borrowed from biblical imagery in order to make their movie. Now, even though Israel was a special people and God had marked them, like he did with told Abraham, they could not approach God any way they wanted to. Just because they were, God wanted to use them to be a blessing to a world, that didn't even give them the right to say, hey, he's my God, I can go right up there and do what I need to do. They couldn't approach him in any way they chose. They had to come to God in the way that God chose, just like Abel did, and just like Noah did. They had to approach God on God's terms. Let's see, people can choose what they will do. God will allow you to choose what you want to do. You can come to God any way you want. What you can't do is choose the consequences of that decision. And in that's what God is doing. He is choosing the consequences about what they're doing. When they come to God, they must remember that he is God. But if you come to God, you need to come on his terms. And like I said, if you don't want to come to him on his terms, then there will be consequences. Both ways. Coming to God on God's terms, not coming to God on God's terms, both have consequences. It's just which one would you rather face? The consequences of obeying God and doing what he wanted, or that which he doesn't want you to do? So, when God makes a contract, let me read one verse here. Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 and 2. And it says this, and God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. So what he's doing is he's reminding the people of Israel who he is and what he has done. He says, I am the God, and I am God who spoke all these words to you. I am the Lord your God, your God. It says, I'm the one that brought you out of the land of Egypt. And so that brought you out of bondage. So he's reminding them who he is and what he has done. And when God makes a contract, now it's irrevocable. It's it can't be taken back. It can't be saying, we don't like that contract, we don't want to obey it anymore. No, once the contract is agreed to, then the rules take place. They set in. The rules come into effect. And so that's what they do. And the reason why God would honor his contract that way is because his nature and character are at stake. God wants to display who he is to the people so that they can enjoy him and be blessed forever. And so what he's doing here, he's showing them his nature and character through these laws, letting them understand what he is like. So, and we know that in James 2:10, it says this, for whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. So what he's saying here is that, listen, to the people of Israel, he says, yes, I'm going to give you the law, but if you mess up on one law, you're guilty of the whole thing. The law is the law. If you break the law, you've broken all of the law. It's just as bad. It doesn't mean you have to do all those things. It just means that the law is a unified whole. It's not a bunch of separate laws. It's one thing. It's, like breaking the speed limit. If you break the speed limit, it doesn't make any difference whether you're going 40 in a 35 or 75 in a 70. You're breaking the speed limit. The speed limit is a singular term, but it encompasses all the different speeds that are in there. And in the same way, God is doing the same thing here. He is, there are all these separate laws, but they encompass one whole. And to break one part of it means you're breaking all of it. It's just that's what it is. So let's talk for a second, just a minute here, about what God's purpose is in giving the law, okay? Let me read a few things here. He wanted Israel to realize that they would never please him through their own efforts. They would never be able to meet his requirements. Now that sounds like a funny thing to say. God gave the law so that they would realize they couldn't do it. Yes, that's exactly what he was doing. Man by nature thinks he's good enough to do whatever God wants him to do. And so what he's wanting to prove to them is no, they can't do that. They need him. And as long as you can fulfill the law, or as long as you think you can do it, then what's the need for God? But when you realize you can't do it and your only hope is that, then your need is for him. And he wants them to realize it. He wanted them to realize that they were sinners and not righteous people or better than others. He wanted them to see that they were just like everybody else. I think I've told you this illustration before about the framers of our Constitution. When every one of those men understood two principles. One, they all knew that they were flawed men. Two, so was everyone else. They knew everybody else was too. And so they devised a document not to control flawed people, but to control flawed people with power. And so that's what they were trying to do. God's not trying to control flawed people with power. He is wanting them to realize what they really were. Sinners who have turned their back on God, and God has had to judge them as a result of that. He wanted them to realize that they were no better than any of the other nations around them. You know, they did the same things as the people around them. The Israelites were sinners and deserved to be punished, just like those nations that had turned to idolatry. And you'll see as we go on whether or not they are like the people around them. But he wanted them to realize that a sinner is a sinner, bar none. So from Adam on, his nature that was given to the people in the time of Noah, to Cain, to the people in the time of Noah, to the people at the Tower of Babel, to all the different things that were going on. All of those things, all those peoples, all those failures were a result of one man's sin, and only one sin that he committed. So that's what happened. He wanted them to realize it. He wanted them to realize that the law, though perfect, because God gave it, and God cannot do anything that is inconsistent with his nature. So if he's a perfect God, the law by nature will be perfect. Okay? He wanted them to realize that the law, though perfect, because it had been given by God, could never bring people to God. It could only show people what they were. In other words, they had no ability to do anything about their situation other than recognize it and admit it to the Lord. And so he wanted them to come to that point. The law could only show what we really are. And well, anyway, we'll talk more about the law as we get into the next few lessons. He wanted them to realize that the only way to truly please God was to trust in his merciful provision for a promised Redeemer who would come. That's what he was wanting them to trust in, that deliverer, that Redeemer. He was going to be the fulfillment of the promise to Adam and Eve that one day the child of the woman would come along, the promise that he gave to Abraham, a deliverer would take place, that in him all nations of the earth shall be blessed, and through his seed that would happen, and so on. And this deliverer would take care of the sin issue once and for all. And so he wanted them to realize that. So, the righteous requirements of the law. The law demands perfect obedience. Not partial, not mostly, but absolute obedience. There can be no flaws from the time you're doing it till the time you die, from the time you're born. Okay? We cannot weigh the good works and the bad works against each other. We can't sit there and say, well, if my good works are more than my bad works, then okay, then I'll make it, you know. Good works, let me give you an example. Because good and evil are two different things. They're not different aspects of the same thing. They're just different things altogether. They're diametrically opposed. Good works are like a cubic foot of helium. Bad works are like a cubic foot of lead. And if you put a cubic foot of lead and a cubic foot of helium on scales, what's going to happen? Are they going to balance out? Even though they're the same size? No, because they're different. They weigh different. They have different measurements. The penalties for those are much, much greater. My good works will never overcome my bad works. It just won't. And so that's why we have to trust in a deliverer. Romans 3, verse 10 to 12 says this, "As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks after God. They have all turned aside. They have together become unprofitable. There is none who does. There is none who does good. No, not one." So what he's saying there, he's revealing something kind of after the fact. It isn't that men weren't sinners before this event, but what he's doing is many years later, this person is writing about the nature of man in general from Adam on. Nobody does good. We all fail. We're flawed by nature. And so the works, the produce of a flawed plant is a flawed fruit. And so that's what we are. So we are flawed by nature. We don't have it, and we can't brag. We just can't brag on ourselves because there's nothing to brag about. So the purpose for giving the law was to reveal what was in our hearts. God wanted us to see what's really inside, what is really our core value. No one is free from the effects of sin or its consequences. No one. Everybody feels the effect of it. No missionary, no preacher, no man, no woman, no child. All of us. Black, white, red, yellow, brown, purple, polka dot, as I've said before. All, whether race, gender, age, time, it doesn't make any difference. We are all flawed people, and we feel the effects, the consequences of Adam's act. And he passed that on to all of us. And like I said, his first child was a murderer, and his second child was the victim. That was the result of Adam's sin. And everybody after that was carrying the same seed in there inside of them. You need to remember this. No one is better or worse than the person next to them. So whether you're a husband and wife, whether you're a male or female, whether you're a child, adult, no matter what nationality you are, race, religion, whatever, all of us are flawed. And because we're flawed, we're guilty before God. That's where we're at. So we all need the same deliverer whom God promised would come. Every one of us. We need something outside of ourselves to save us. There's nothing we can do. These last two lessons that we've been doing here, the one I did before and then this one here, they're in preparing us for the next three lessons. The next three lessons are huge because we're going to talk about the law specifically. Up to this point, we've been talking about preparing for the law. It's getting people ready to face God and the laws that he wants to give. The agreement that they agreed to, the contract that they agreed to and signed the dotted line when they said all that he says we will do, that's what we're going to be talking about for the next three lessons. What is this contract that they signed? And we're going to talk about that in great detail. So these two lessons, these last two, have been in preparation for the next three lessons. These last two lessons were taught so that what we would realize what God was trying to teach Israel all along. And so he's working on that. God wanted Israel to realize that they were sinners and needed his mercy and grace to be saved from sin, Satan, and eternal punishment. That's what he was wanting them to understand. He wanted them to realize that they could not come to God on their own terms. They had to come to God on God's terms. He wanted them to realize that their only hope was in a promised Redeemer or Deliverer, however you want to call it, who would one day come and take care of the sin issue once and for all. So they're wanting to know that. And he wanted them to realize that he and he alone had the answers to life and death. See, that's the whole point of all that we've been talking about up to this point, is to get people to understand who God is and our need for him. And so what he's doing is he's given us these events throughout history, showing us what man is like over and over and over again, but also what he is like over and over and over again. And also what Satan is like over and over and over again. And so we can learn to understand what Satan's like, what God is like, what we are like, and that relationship between us. And so we need to, if we're going to come and have a relationship with God, if that relationship is to be mended, it has to be done on God's terms, not ours. So, just want to thank you all this week for listening in. This has been fun kind of doing this on the road. I know it doesn't look the same with background and so on, but that's okay. It's what we're listening to, and I hope it's important to you, and I hope you really think about it. So you guys take care. Now remember, if you have some friends that want to listen to this, please have them, tag them and tell them about our podcast. And like I say, they can get on their favorite podcast app and just look up my name, Doug Schaible, Schaible, or the Premature Bible Institute, or and if they want to watch it on YouTube, which I do that also, just have them get on YouTube and search for Doug Schaible and subscribe. And by the way, have them subscribe to the podcast too. And just listen to it when you're driving down the road, or if you have time, you want to just watch something for a morning service. Maybe you know what? Here's something I hadn't thought about. Maybe you have somebody that's in a hospital that wants to listen to something. Maybe they could listen to it on the video, the YouTube. And maybe this would be something that would be an encouragement to them to see God in action. So think about that, and thanks so much, and just be praying for you, and pray for me that I just keep my mind clear and my mouth clear too as I speak. Take care of yourselves. We'll talk to you next week. Bye.